Some stories don't begin with a scream. They begin quietly, years earlier, in places no one thinks to question. A childhood moment, a look held for too long, a presence that doesn't announce itself, but waits. Mausoleum opens with that kind of unease, the feeling that whatever is about to happen has already happened once before. Released in 1983, Mausoleum arrived during a time when possession films were still living in the shadow of The Exorcist. But instead of copying the formula, this film chose a stranger path. It didn't rush toward priests, rituals, or explanations. It planted its horror in memory in the idea that something could take hold of a person so early, so completely, that it no longer needed permission to return. The result wasn't a clean battle between good and evil, but something far more uncomfortable, a slow erosion of identity. At first glance, Mausoleum looks like a typical early 80 seconds horror film, modest budget, familiar genre beats, and a story that seems to promise answers by the final reel. But what kept the film alive long after its release wasn't its plot, it was its imagery. Faces that didn't move the way faces should, transformations that felt physical, painful, and real. Effects that relied entirely on human hands, not computers, and demanded a price from the people wearing them. Audiences at the time weren't sure what to do with it. Critics dismissed it. Box office numbers came and went. And yet, quietly, Mausoleum refused to disappear. On VHS shelves, late-night broadcasts, and horror forums decades later, the film developed a reputation not as a masterpiece, but as something unsettling that lingered longer than expected. Because beneath the demons and distortions, Mausoleum raises an uncomfortable question it never fully answers. Is the horror coming from an external force, or from something that has been shaping the character since childhood? And if the difference is never made clear, does it even matter? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about. Mausoleum 1983, a film where possession isn't just an event, but a condition that never really leaves. 1. Long before possession became a spectacle of shouting priests and collapsing rooms, Mausoleum chose a far quieter entry point: childhood. The film opens the door to horror, not through ritual, but through memory. The possession doesn't arrive suddenly. It settles in early, almost patiently, as if waiting for the right moment to resurface. What makes this approach unsettling is how little the film explains. There is no clear origin story, no detailed mythology to cling to. The audience is never told exactly what entered the girl's life, only that something did. By the time she reaches adulthood, the damage has already been done. The possession isn't a foreign invasion anymore, it's a part of her psychological landscape. This was a deliberate choice. Rather than positioning evil as an outside force that attacks and leaves, Mausoleum frames it as something that grows alongside its host. Childhood trauma, suppressed fear, and supernatural influence are woven together so tightly that separating them becomes impossible. The film never clarifies whether the demon created the instability or merely took advantage of. That ambiguity was risky, especially in the early 1980 seconds. Horror audiences were accustomed to rules and resolutions. Mausoleum offered neither. Instead, it leaned into discomfort, forcing viewers to sit with the idea that some forms of possession don't announce themselves, they develop quietly, over years. And by starting the story so early in the character's life, the film suggests something far more disturbing than a single moment of corruption: the possibility that by the time help arrives, it's already too late. 2. The performance at the center of Mausoleum relies less on dialogue and more on physical restraint, a choice that often goes unnoticed. The actress portraying the possessed woman spends much of the film doing very little on the surface. No constant screaming, no exaggerated movements, just controlled stillness. This restraint wasn't accidental. The direction emphasized subtle behavioral shifts rather than obvious signals of evil: a pause before speaking, a stare held a second too long, a facial expression that feels almost correct but not entirely. These moments create tension not because they are loud, but because they feel wrong in a way that's hard to define. During filming, the actress was encouraged to treat the possession as something internal, not theatrical. Instead of acting possessed, she was asked to imagine a second presence constantly observing, interrupting, and occasionally slipping through. That internalized approach gave the performance an unsettling calm, even in moments of violence or transformation. It also blurred the line between victim and threat. The character isn't overtly monstrous for most of the film. She appears functional, composed, and socially acceptable, which raises a disturbing question the film never resolves. How much of what we see is the demon acting, and how much is the character choosing not to fight anymore? By avoiding exaggerated behavior, Mausoleum makes the possession feel plausible. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just quietly invasive, and that restraint is exactly what allows the later visual effects to hit harder, because when the mask finally slips, it feels earned. 3. Mausoleum is remembered less for its story than for its faces, and that's no accident. The film's most enduring legacy lies in its practical makeup effects, which pushed physical discomfort to the foreground in a way few low-budget films dared to attempt. The transformation scenes relied entirely on prosthetics, latex appliances, and mechanical distortion. No digital assistance, no shortcuts. Each facial alteration had to be physically attached, layered, and manipulated on set. Some applications took several hours, requiring the actress to remain still while layers of makeup hardened directly onto her skin. What made these effects unsettling wasn't just their appearance, it was their weight. The prosthetics restricted movement, altered breathing, and created genuine strain. Crew members later described moments when discomfort became part of the performance. Whether intended or not, the pain wasn't simulated, it was managed. This physicality gave the transformations an organic quality. The face didn't morph smoothly, it resisted, it pulled. It seemed to fight against what was happening, a visual echo of the character's internal struggle. Even today, the effects feel tactile in a way digital imagery often doesn't. Ironically, these practical effects may have overshadowed the film itself. Critics dismissed the narrative, but audiences remembered the imagery, faces that felt wrong, expressions that seemed to collapse inward, the kind of visuals that linger not because they are flashy, but because they feel uncomfortably real. And perhaps that's why Mausoleum never fully faded away, not because of what it said, but because of what it showed, using nothing but human hands and human faces. 4. Unlike many possession films of its era, Mausoleum deliberately avoids religious structure. There are no prolonged rituals, no authoritative figures stepping in with answers, and no clear moral framework to guide the audience. This absence wasn't due to budget limitations, it was a narrative decision that quietly reshaped how the horror functions. By removing religion as a stabilizing force, the film denies viewers a familiar safety net. There is no moment where evil is formally identified, named, or challenged in an organized way. Instead, the threat exists in isolation, unfolding in private spaces, behind closed doors, where no institution seems capable of intervening. This choice reframes possession as something deeply personal rather than cosmic. The horror doesn't escalate into a public spectacle, it stays contained, intimate, and uncomfortable. Evil isn't fought with belief systems or rituals, it simply persists, unchecked. In doing so, Mausoleum places responsibility back onto the character rather than an external savior. The film quietly suggests that if the possession began internally, no outside authority may be able to remove it. That implication unsettled early audiences who expected resolution through familiar genre mechanics. By refusing to offer spiritual closure, the film leaves viewers with a more disturbing possibility. Some forces aren't defeated, they're merely endured. 5. The house in Mausoleum is more than a backdrop. It functions as a psychological extension of the character herself. Its architecture, lighting, and spatial layout subtly mirror her internal state, ordered on the surface, increasingly distorted underneath. Wide rooms feel empty rather than safe. Corridors stretch just long enough to create discomfort. Corners are framed to suggest observation, as if the space itself is watching. The camera rarely treats the house as neutral ground. Instead, it lingers, implying that something has already claimed the environment. Production design played a key role here. Set dressing avoided overt Gothic exaggeration, favoring realism with slight imbalance. Objects are placed just off-center, lighting shifts without clear motivation. The house feels lived in but never restful. This grounding in realism strengthens the horror. The setting doesn't announce danger, it absorbs it. As the character's control slips, the environment feels increasingly complicit, as though the possession has seeped beyond the body and into the walls. By the end of the film, the house no longer feels like a place where events happen. It feels like a participant, silent, patient, and permanently altered by what it has witnessed. 6. Mausoleum was released at an awkward moment in horror history. The genre was shifting rapidly toward louder, bloodier, and more commercially aggressive films. Slashers were dominating theaters, supernatural horror was becoming more sensational, subtlety was no longer a selling point. As a result, the film struggled to find its audience. It wasn't violent enough to compete with emerging splatter trends, yet too bleak and restrained to appeal to mainstream viewers seeking spectacle. Critics dismissed it as underdeveloped, marketing failed to communicate its tone. But time reshaped its reception. On VHS and late-night television, Mausoleum found viewers who weren't distracted by expectations, watched alone, in quiet settings. Its slow unease became its strength rather than its flaw. The film's reputation shifted from forgettable to oddly persistent. Horror fans didn't praise it, they remembered it. And in cult cinema, memory matters more than approval. Mausoleum didn't survive because it was loved. It survived because it refused to resolve itself cleanly. And sometimes, the films that linger longest are the ones that never fully explain what they were trying to say. 7. One of the strangest creative decisions in Mausoleum is how deliberately it avoids explaining the rules of its own horror. There is no clear boundary between when the possession is active and when it is dormant. No signal, no trigger. The film refuses to give the audience a framework for prediction. In most possession narratives, escalation follows a pattern. Symptoms worsen, control is lost. A climax arrives, Mausoleum disrupts that rhythm. Moments of apparent normality sit directly beside moments of violence or distortion. With no warning and no narrative preparation, the effect is disorienting, intentionally so. This lack of structure mirrors the character's experience. If she doesn't know when the presence will surface, neither does the viewer. Control feels temporary. Safety feels conditional. Even calm scenes carry a low-level tension because nothing guarantees they will remain calm. The film's editing reinforces this uncertainty. Transitions are abrupt. Emotional shifts happen without musical cues. Scenes end before resolution feels earned. Rather than guiding the audience, the film withholds guidance entirely. That choice frustrated many early viewers, but it also gave the film its lingering unease. By denying rules, Mausoleum suggests a disturbing idea. Possession doesn't always follow logic. Sometimes it simply exists unpredictable, unexplained, and impossible to contain. 8. Sound design in Mausoleum is deceptively restrained, but carefully calculated. Instead of relying on constant musical cues to signal danger, the film often allows silence to dominate. When sound does enter, it arrives subtly and often too late to prepare the audience. Breathing becomes a recurring motif, not always loud, not always emphasized, just present enough to register. In several scenes, the character's breathing is slightly out of sync with her movements, creating a barely noticeable sense of disconnect. It's unsettling precisely because it's easy to miss. The score, when used, avoids grand themes. Instead, it leans toward low-frequency tones and minimal repetition. Music doesn't announce horror, it trails behind it, as if responding rather than leading. This reversal places the audience in a reactive position, constantly catching up. Even environmental sounds are treated carefully. Footsteps echo longer than expected, doors close without finality, rooms sound hollow. Even when occupied, the world of Mausoleum feels acoustically unstable, reinforcing the sense that nothing is firmly grounded. By resisting aggressive sound design, the film allows discomfort to grow naturally. Silence becomes a warning rather than relief. And when sound finally intrudes, it feels invasive, as though something has broken through a barrier that was never meant to be crossed. 9. Despite its supernatural surface, Mausoleum consistently frames its horror through the lens of control. Who has it, who loses it, and whether it can ever truly be reclaimed. The demon, if it exists, rarely asserts dominance through spectacle. Instead, it erodes autonomy piece by piece. The character's choices become increasingly questionable, not because she appears unaware, but because her responses feel delayed, muted, or emotionally distant. She reacts, but not fully. This creates the impression that something else is always one step ahead, quietly influencing outcomes. What's unsettling is that the film never confirms when control is completely lost. There is no clear moment of surrender, no definitive point of no return. Control slips gradually, unevenly, and without ceremony. Even acts of resistance feel compromised. This ambiguity invites a darker interpretation. If possession doesn't eliminate free will entirely, then responsibility becomes blurred. Are the actions committed under influence or enabled by it? The film refuses to answer, leaving the audience to sit with the discomfort of moral uncertainty. By the time the story reaches its final act, control no longer feels like something to be regained. It feels like something that was never fully there to begin with, and that realization is more disturbing than any transformation the film puts on screen. 10. One of the most overlooked aspects of Mausoleum is how deliberately it avoids treating possession as a spectacle meant to impress. Even during its most visually striking moments, the film resists exaggeration. Transformations are shown briefly, often partially obscured, and rarely linger long enough to become performative. This restraint wasn't a technical limitation, it was a tonal decision. By withholding full visual confirmation, the film allows the audience's imagination to fill in the gaps. What isn't shown becomes as important as what is. Faces distort, but not always completely. Expressions break, but not long enough to stabilize into something recognizable. The camera frequently cuts away at the moment viewers expect escalation. Instead of rewarding attention with clarity, Mausoleum replaces it with uncertainty. This creates a feeling of interruption, as though the audience is being denied access to something private and invasive. That approach aligns with the film's broader themes. Possession here isn't meant to be observed comfortably. It's something happening beneath the surface, resisting exposure. By limiting visual payoff, the film refuses to let horror become entertainment in the traditional sense. For some viewers, this felt unsatisfying. For others, it made the experience linger. The mind replays what it didn't quite see, searching for meaning in fragments. And in that unfinished space, Mausoleum finds its quiet power, not by showing everything, but by knowing exactly when to stop. 11. Mausoleum places surprising emphasis on emotional isolation. Even when characters share physical space, conversations feel incomplete. Responses arrive slightly late. Dialogue often skirts around the subject rather than confronting it directly. This isn't accidental writing, it's a pattern. The possessed character is rarely met with genuine understanding. People around her notice changes, but their concern remains surface level. Questions are asked, but not pursued. Warnings are voiced, then quickly dismissed. The film repeatedly shows moments where intervention feels possible and then slips away. This emotional distance amplifies the horror. Possession doesn't just separate the character from herself, it separates her from others. The lack of meaningful connection creates an environment where the presence can thrive unnoticed, unchallenged, and ultimately unopposed. What's unsettling is how familiar this dynamic feels. The film suggests that the most dangerous conditions aren't dramatic confrontations, but prolonged neglect. Evil doesn't need secrecy when indifference does the work for it. By portraying isolation as a slow, cumulative process, Mausoleum reframes possession as a failure of connection as much as a supernatural event. And by the time isolation becomes obvious, the damage is already irreversible, not because no one saw it, but because no one stayed long enough to stop it. 12. The ending of Mausoleum is often remembered as abrupt, but its unresolved nature is consistent with everything that comes before it. Rather than offering closure, the film withdraws. It doesn't resolve the possession. It doesn't restore balance. It simply stops. This refusal to explain was controversial. Viewers expected answers, or at least confirmation of what they had witnessed. Instead, the film leaves its central question deliberately unanswered. Was the evil defeated, contained, or merely paused? The lack of resolution reframes the entire story retroactively. Events don't feel like a journey toward healing or salvation. They feel like documentation, a glimpse into an ongoing condition. The story ends, but the implication is that the situation does not. By denying narrative closure, Mausoleum challenges the idea that horror must conclude with victory or understanding. It suggests something colder, that some experiences don't resolve neatly, and some influences don't leave simply because the story demands it. This ambiguity frustrated audiences, expecting finality, but over time, it became one of the film's most distinctive traits. Long after the details fade, the uncertainty remains, and that lingering discomfort may be the film's most honest statement of all. 13. One reason Mausoleum feels unusually detached is its pacing, which refuses to accelerate in the way audiences expect from possession horror. Instead of building toward constant escalation, the film moves in uneven waves, tension rises, stalls, then quietly resurfaces somewhere else, often without warning. This pacing creates a sense of emotional fatigue rather than adrenaline. Viewers aren't carried forward by momentum, they're worn down by repetition and uncertainty. Moments of calm don't reset the experience. They feel temporary, fragile, and vaguely dishonest. The film repeatedly introduces scenes that should feel like turning points, only to drain them of payoff. Confrontations don't resolve anything. Discoveries lead nowhere. Even acts of violence feel strangely muted, as if the film is less interested in impact than in erosion. This structure mirrors the internal state of the possessed character. There is no single crisis moment, no clear threshold where everything changes. Instead, control diminishes gradually, almost imperceptibly, until resistance feels pointless. The horror isn't sudden loss, it's slow acceptance. Many early viewers misread this pacing as incompetence, but in retrospect, it feels intentional. Mausoleum isn't designed to excite, it's designed to exhaust. By the time the film reaches its final moments, the audience doesn't feel shocked, they feel resigned. And resignation, the film suggests, may be the most dangerous state of all. When fear becomes familiar, it no longer demands action. It simply becomes part of the environment. 14. Mausoleum uses mirrors sparingly, but when they appear, they carry weight. Reflections are never casual. They're framed deliberately, often held longer than necessary, as if the film is asking viewers to look twice and then doubt what they see. In several key moments, the character's reflection feels slightly misaligned, not distorted enough to be overtly supernatural, but just enough to register as wrong. The image lags, the expression doesn't quite match. The mirror becomes a space of hesitation rather than confirmation. Unlike films that use mirrors to reveal hidden monsters, Mausoleum uses them to question identity. The reflection doesn't expose the demon directly, it exposes uncertainty. The character sees herself but not fully, and the audience shares that incomplete perception. This subtle use of reflection reinforces the film's central ambiguity. If possession has been present since childhood, then which version of the self is real, the one acting now, or the one remembered? The mirror offers no answer. It only highlights the fracture. By refusing dramatic mirror scares, the film avoids spectacle and leans into psychological unease. The reflection isn't a threat. It's a reminder that whatever has taken hold doesn't need to hide anymore. It can look back openly, knowing it won't be challenged. 15. The demon in Mausoleum is intentionally underdefined, and that vagueness is one of the film's most unsettling choices. There is no name spoken with authority, no clear mythology explained through exposition. The presence exists without context, history, or rules. This absence forces the audience to confront a more uncomfortable possibility, that the demon may not be a distinct entity at all. It could be symbolic, it could be psychological, or it could be something that doesn't require explanation to function. By refusing to define the threat, the film denies viewers the comfort of classification. Evil isn't something that can be studied, categorized, or understood. It simply is. And because it lacks identity, it becomes harder to resist. This ambiguity also protects the film from aging poorly. While many possession movies are tied to specific belief systems or cultural fears, Mausoleum remains unanchored. Its horror isn't about faith or doctrine, it's about loss of agency, a theme that never goes out of date. The demon's lack of definition shifts focus back onto the character. What matters isn't what the presence wants, but what it erodes: personality, choice, resistance. By the time viewers realize this, the film's true subject becomes clear. Mausoleum isn't interested in defeating evil, it's interested in showing what happens when something is allowed to stay long enough to feel permanent. 16. One detail often overlooked in Mausoleum is how the film treats time as something unreliable. Events don't always feel sequential, scenes follow one another logically, but emotionally they seem displaced, as if the character is experiencing fragments rather than a continuous present. This effect is subtle but persistent. Days pass without clear markers. Emotional states shift faster than circumstances justify. The audience senses progression but struggles to measure it. Time feels compressed in some moments and stretched thin in others, creating the impression that the character is no longer fully anchored in her own timeline. This temporal instability mirrors the nature of long-term possession as the film presents it. If something has been present since childhood, then the present is never fully separate from the past. Memories bleed forward. Trauma refuses to stay contained. The character isn't just haunted, she's layered. Editing reinforces this sensation. Cuts arrive early, scenes end before emotional closure forms. Transitions feel functional rather than expressive, denying the viewer emotional orientation. The story moves forward, but without the reassurance of rhythm. Rather than marking possession as a dramatic interruption, Mausoleum presents it as a condition that distorts perception itself. Time becomes something endured rather than experienced. The character doesn't move through life, she drifts within it. This approach quietly deepens the horror. If time can no longer be trusted, then recovery becomes meaningless. There is no clear before to return to. And without a stable timeline, the idea of healing feels abstract, distant, and increasingly irrelevant. 17. Violence in Mausoleum is surprisingly restrained, especially for an early 1980 seconds horror film. When it occurs, it rarely feels cathartic. There are no triumphant moments, no dramatic releases of tension. Violence arrives abruptly, then recedes, leaving discomfort rather than relief. This restraint shifts the audience's expectations. Instead of anticipating payoff, viewers are conditioned to expect interruption. The film treats violence as a symptom, not a climax. It doesn't resolve conflict, it exposes imbalance. Even when harm is inflicted, the camera resists indulgence. Shots are functional, impact is implied more often than shown. The emphasis remains on consequence rather than spectacle. What matters isn't what happens in the moment, it's what lingers afterward. This approach aligns with the film's broader philosophy. Possession isn't framed as a series of outbursts, but as a sustained condition. Violence doesn't escalate the story, it confirms it. Each incident reinforces the idea that control has already been compromised long before action occurs. By denying the audience sensationalism, Mausoleum keeps its horror grounded. There is no release valve, no moment where fear is transformed into excitement. Instead, tension accumulates quietly, without permission to dissipate. The result is unsettling in a different way. Violence doesn't shock, it reminds. It signals that whatever has taken hold doesn't need to prove itself anymore. It acts when it chooses, without urgency and without consequence. 18. What ultimately defines Mausoleum is its refusal to offer hope as a narrative reward. Even moments that resemble recovery are treated with suspicion. Calm never feels stable. Improvement never feels permanent. The film repeatedly suggests that relief is temporary and possibly imagined. This perspective stands in contrast to many possession films that frame endurance as progress. In Mausoleum, survival doesn't equal victory. Continuing to function doesn't mean the threat has diminished. It may simply mean it has adapted. The character's ability to move through daily life becomes ambiguous. Is it strength, or is it resignation? The film refuses to celebrate resilience, because resilience here may be indistinguishable from surrender. Living with the presence doesn't defeat it, it normalizes it. This ambiguity strips comfort from the narrative. Viewers aren't invited to root for transformation. They're asked to observe persistence. The story doesn't build toward salvation, it circles around endurance, quietly questioning its value. By the time the film nears its end, the idea of escape feels irrelevant. What matters is permanence. The presence doesn't need dominance to win, it needs time. And in that sense, Mausoleum delivers its most unsettling suggestion. Some horrors don't arrive to destroy, they arrive to stay. And once they've settled in, the concept of after may no longer apply. 19. Mausoleum quietly undermines one of horror's most comforting assumptions that recognition leads to resistance. In many possession stories, identifying the threat becomes the first step toward defeating it. Naming the evil gives characters leverage. Understanding brings strategy. But in Mausoleum, recognition changes almost nothing. By the time the character becomes aware that something is wrong, the awareness feels late, even performative. Knowledge doesn't grant control. It only sharpens the sense of helplessness. The film repeatedly suggests that understanding the presence does not weaken it, it may even strengthen it. This is reflected in how information functions within the story. Discoveries are made, but rarely acted upon. Clues surface, then dissolve into inaction. Awareness accumulates without consequence. The threat doesn't hide once it's noticed. It continues as before, indifferent to being observed. This dynamic challenges a core narrative instinct. Viewers expect progress to follow realization. Mausoleum denies that satisfaction. Instead, it presents knowledge as something passive, an acknowledgement rather than a weapon. The character isn't empowered by understanding, she's burdened by it. By reframing recognition as insufficient, the film shifts responsibility away from ignorance and toward inevitability. If knowing doesn't help, then resistance becomes symbolic rather than practical. The struggle loses its strategic dimension and becomes purely existential. This idea unsettled early audiences, but it aligns perfectly with the film's tone. Mausoleum isn't interested in the mechanics of defeat, it's interested in endurance under awareness, the psychological weight of knowing what's happening and realizing that it may not matter. And that realization lingers longer than any revelation, because once recognition loses its power, the audience is left with a more disturbing question. If understanding isn't enough, then whatever could be. 20. The lasting reputation of Mausoleum isn't built on admiration, but on memory. People don't often recommend it enthusiastically. They mention it hesitantly, as something they saw once and never fully forgot without being sure why. This kind of legacy is rare. The film doesn't deliver iconic lines or celebrated performances. It offers no clear moral. What it leaves behind is a sensation, a vague discomfort that resists classification. Viewers struggle to articulate what unsettled them, only that something did. That persistence is rooted in the film's refusal to resolve its core tensions. Possession isn't cured. Identity isn't restored. Meaning isn't clarified. The story ends, but the condition continues, at least conceptually. The audience isn't invited to move on. They're left suspended. Over time, this unresolved quality allowed Mausoleum to age differently from its peers. While louder films became dated, this one remained elusive. Its lack of specificity protected it. Its ambiguity aged into relevance. In retrospect, the film feels less like a finished statement and more like an artifact, a snapshot of an anxiety that never received closure. That may explain why it surfaces repeatedly in quiet corners of horror discussion, often without context or conclusion. Mausoleum didn't survive because it explained itself well, it survived because it didn't. It left viewers with fragments, impressions, and unanswered questions. The raw material of obsession, and perhaps that was its most effective possession of all. Not of a character, but of the audience. Long after the film ends, it remains incomplete, unresolved, and quietly present. What makes Mausoleum linger long after it ends is not any single scene, effect, or moment of shock. It's the film's quiet insistence that possession may be indistinguishable from adaptation. By the final minutes, the story no longer feels like it's asking whether the presence can be removed. It feels like it's asking whether removal was ever the point. Throughout the film, the character doesn't steadily deteriorate in the way possession narratives usually demand. She adjusts, she functions, she survives, and that survival is presented without celebration. The film never frames endurance as triumph. It treats it as accommodation. This reframing alters everything that came before. If the presence has existed since childhood, then the character's adult life hasn't been interrupted by possession. It has been shaped by it. Her personality, her decisions, even her moments of apparent normalcy may not exist despite the influence. But because of it, seen this way, Mausoleum stops being a story about invasion and becomes one about coexistence. Not peaceful coexistence, but normalized coexistence, the kind that emerges when resistance has been attempted, failed, and quietly abandoned. That interpretation is unsettling because it refuses moral clarity. There is no moment where the audience can confidently say, this is where the character was lost. Loss here is gradual, invisible, and never officially acknowledged. The presence doesn't conquer through force, it integrates through time. And that may be the film's most disturbing implication, that some horrors don't announce themselves as enemies. They settle in early, shape a life, and wait patiently until their influence feels ordinary. If that's true, then the real terror of Mausoleum isn't possession itself, it's the possibility that, by the time it's recognized, it already feels like home. Mausoleum never tries to convince you that what you witnessed can be undone. It simply presents a condition, lets it unfold, and then steps away, leaving the audience to decide what was real, what was symbolic, and what was quietly accepted along the way. That unresolved feeling is why the film continues to resurface decades later, not as a classic, but as a question that never quite closes. If you've seen Mausoleum, which part stayed with you the longest, the possession itself, or the idea that it may have started long before anyone noticed? And do you think the presence was something supernatural or something far more human? Let us know in the comments, and tell us which forgotten horror film you think deserves to be uncovered next.